Hello, you're watching Eastern Europe Review, a program dedicated to the situation in Belarus, Ukraine and Russia. This is a joint production of BELSAT TV and TVP World. My name is Dmitry Mitskevich, and let's take a look at the headlines. Why did American journalist TuckerCarlson record an interview with the author of Putin's ideology?
That in fact we conservative pro-Putin Russians are just like you. Let's fight bad liberalism together.
How Russians struggle to survive in villages far in the north, almost cut off from the rest of the world.
When the weather is bad, we sit in darkness. And now, even though we have electricity, there is no communication.
Protests in Georgia and Armenia. Russia's influence looms shadow over the Southern Caucasus.
Russia fights in different ways. In Ukraine, it uses PMC Wagner and criminals. In Moldova, it uses Gagauzes. The same thing happened in Georgia.
TuckerCarlson emphasized that the Kremlin is targeting a Western conservative audience in its efforts to disseminate Russian propaganda. An American anchor has conducted a new interview, this time with the controversial philosopher Alexander Dugin, even doomed audience by some Russians.
The future seems to resemble the Terminator, with Putin portrayed as the primary defender of Christianity and family values, armed with nuclear weapons.
The idea is to get an airing in English.
American TV presenter Tucker known for controversial interviews, recently conducted an interview with Alexander Dugin, often referred to as the main proponent of the concept of the Russian world. Due to this association, Dugin is included in the sanctions list of the European Union, the USA, and Canada.
Now he is famous the world over, in the English language press anyway, as, quote, Putin's brain. But he is not a political figure here in Russia. He is, once again, a philosopher. And his ideas are deeply offensive to some people.
At the beginning of the interview, Carlson introduces Alexander Dugin to ordinary Americans, deliberately distancing him from Putin and omitting any mention of calls to kill Ukrainians. Just a month earlier, TuckerCarlson had released an interview with the Russian president himself. A former speechwriter for Putin suggested that because Vladimir Putin was unable to effectively convey the concept of the Russian world to Western audiences, Carlson had to speak directly with the mastermind behind this idea.
Unexpectedly for the people who organized that interview, Putin plunged into history, and the conversation went off in completely the wrong direction. The only message that could have worked, a conservative one, didn't get across.
The Russian world is the idea that there is a distinct Russian civilization different to the Western civilization, and this civilization has its own specific path with its own values and its own idea of how the state should be structured.
Why do you always think that the way you live is better than the way we live? Even the way you ask questions. Why don't you guys do the way we do it? Because we're not you, and we don't like you much, really.
Dugin portrays Putin armed with nuclear weapons as a defender of peace and traditional values to the American audience. He asserts that this is the true reason why Western liberals demonize the Russian president.
First of all, Putin is traditional leader with success to restore traditional values, sovereignty of the state, Christianity, traditional family.
Political scientist Kirill Martynov believes that Dugin is conducting a very well-calculated marketing campaign. He focuses on conservatives, specifically American conservatives who prioritize economic freedoms and patriarchal values.
Dugin offers them an alliance, a partnership, that in fact we conservative pro-Putin Russians are just like you. Let's fight bad liberalism together. On certain issues, substantively, he is a fanatic. But when it comes to how to package his fanatical ideas, he is a deeply pragmatic and even cynical person.
How successful could this export of so-called Russian traditional values to the West be?
Putin became an informal leader for the ultra-right, for neo-Nazis around the world, and especially in the United States. A long time ago, Putin is indeed seen by them as a defender of traditional values.
However, Karina Orova believes that Putin's audience is still relatively small, consisting mainly of marginal groups within Western societies.
The year 2022 changed a lot, and we see that Putin's traditional friends, even the Italian populist parties, have dramatically changed their attitude towards Putin because their electorate has changed their minds, and today, fortunately, this limits the Kremlin's ability to influence the West.
Maria Snegovaya argues that there is a certain synergy between the Kremlin and right-wing populist parties globally. The discontent expressed by right-wing populists with today's world undoubtedly benefits the Kremlin and its policies, as it contributes to the erosion of institutions established by mainstream parties and politicians in the West in previous years.
Accessing dozens of villages in Russia by roads is impossible. They simply don't exist. Some communities depend on small airplanes for transportation, while in winter, vehicles navigate across frozen rivers. However, in the Russian north, there are even more unconventional methods available.
The Arkhangelsk region is situated in the Russian north. It is the 8th largest region in the country, with almost 1 million inhabitants. It lies thousands of kilometers away from Moscow. Since Soviet times, the region has been a hub for extracting various minerals and natural resources. Among its landscapes of numerous swamps, the extraction of oil, gas, and most notably timber, has predominated. Dozens of small villages have remained since those times, spread out across this vast territory. This is the small settlement of Lipakova in the Arkhangelsk region. Not far from here, rockets are launched from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. Train driver Andrei is loading food, toilet paper and boxes of goods ordered earlier by residents of the even more remote villages of Luzhma and Sieza into the cab of a diesel locomotive built in 1986. A local hunter and a resident of Luzhma are the only passengers on this journey, which departs 3 times a week. They are seated in the cab, where a wood stove installed next to the driver's seat keeps them warm. This road was constructed after the end of the Second World War to facilitate logging in the USSR. In the early 2000s, the timber farms went bankrupt, but the logging villages remained. Now, access to this area is only possible by railway. The final stop, the settlement of Sieza. It was prosperous in the past, but now only 11 pensioners reside here. One of them, Nina Mikhailov, has come to meet the diesel locomotive with a sled. She's going to take home a couple of boxes of food from the last local shop in the village near the station.
Once we had a thriving forestry business, but gradually everything faded away. People are leaving, some have already left, and we are waiting for resettlement. We can't wait any longer. When the weather is bad, we sit in darkness. And now, even though we have electricity, there is no communication. Landline phones don't work, and neither do our mobile phones.
There used to be 3 shops, a large club, a school, a kindergarten, and a daily train service with 3 passenger carriages. After logging ceased, the narrow-gauge railway was sold to a private enterprise and subsequently changed hands multiple times. Currently, the remaining 33 kilometers of track and a diesel locomotive are owned by a local entrepreneur who operates the railway with subsidies from the local authorities. I'm not a magician. What hasn't been done for decades can't be done in a single moment. All these forest settlements face such difficult fates. We'll continue to maintain the road as long as people live here. We'll patch it up anyway. The region has promised to provide us with money this year. Maybe we can do something more. People don't discuss politics much here. Instead, they mostly talk about things that directly affect the residents of Sieza. For instance, they discuss the mobilization efforts that occurred when the war in Ukraine reached this area. However, locals reminisce fondly about the Soviet past.
The times that are criticized now, we remember as the best and happiest. Children were taught while they learned, or rather at that time we studied and traveled. A diesel locomotive with 3 carriages used to make trips in the morning, at lunchtime, and then in the evening.
Each year, officials discuss the possibility of closing the unprofitable railway. However, they continue to finance its operation. But it's not just about money. If the sole old diesel locomotive were to break down, people would be isolated from the outside world. Equipment for such transportation hasn't been manufactured in Russia for a long time. There is no alternative route, apart from the 75-centimeter wide railway track leading here. There are dozens of such isolated places to be found on the map of Russia.
Russia is reluctant to let the South Caucasus shift towards Europe. Whenever Georgia and Armenia move closer to European integration, Moscow intensifies its presence in the region. In Tbilisi, streets have been flooded with massive protests for weeks, fueled by discontent with the government's bill. Meanwhile, in Armenia, dissatisfaction grows over the transfer of 4 villages to Azerbaijan. The shadow of Russia looms large over these events.
Georgia has been protesting against the so-called Russian law for several weeks. Authorities have resorted to using batons, tear gas and water cannons against the demonstrators. Dozens of protesters have been detained. The draft law on the transparency of foreign influence was initiated by the ruling party Georgian Dream, founded by the pro-Russian billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili. Protesters believe that if the bill is adopted, Georgia will deviate from its path towards European integration.
Every member of society who thinks progressively, imagines a European future, and aspires to live in a European country is protesting.
The draft law bears many similarities to Russian legislation on foreign agents. Critics of the bill perceive Russian and even Soviet practices within it. This comes at a time when Georgia just a few months ago gained candidate status for joining the European Union.
Russia's role in this is absolutely direct. Russia serves as an example for Ivanishvili to follow, and there is no doubt that all of this is in Russia's interests.
At the same time, protests erupted in Armenia against the authorities' decision to cede 4 border villages in the Tavush region to Azerbaijan. Local residents denounced it as treason. On April the 19th, Yerevan and Baku agreed on the delimitation of the border. According to the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, he did it to prevent the outbreak of war.
For a political, ethical, civilized dialogue, it's necessary to solve humanitarian issues first. For example, a necessary condition is the release of prisoners of war. In addition, 208 square kilometers of the territory of Armenia are now occupied by Azeri troops. The army must be withdrawn.
Residents of the Tavush region blocked local roads and major highways, receiving support from protesters in Yerevan. The border demarcation underscores the long-standing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, which Azerbaijan reclaimed in autumn last year. In Armenia, there is a belief that Russia gave Azerbaijan the green light for the so-called anti-terrorist operation.
Russia fights in different ways. In Ukraine, it uses PMC Wagner and criminals. In Moldova, it uses Gagauzes. The same thing happened in Georgia. As for Armenia, all these years, Russia has been using Azerbaijan to act against the democratic government of Armenia.
A month ago, Nikol Pashinyan met with Ursula von der Leyen, Josep Borrell, and Antony Blinken, and declared Armenia's readiness for European integration. However, the more Armenia and Georgia aspire to Europe, the more Russia seeks to maintain its influence in the South Caucasus. But now, on the streets of Tbilisi, Georgians are expressing their true feelings towards Russia and its colonial intentions.
Protests aren't stopping and won't stop, because a whole generation of people has grown up who don't know what the Soviet Union is, have little idea of what Russia is, or view it as an enemy and an occupier.
Even though Moscow is trying hard to slow down the processes of European integration in the South Caucasus, it seems that ideologically Russia has already lost both Georgia and Armenia.
That's all for today. Eastern Europe Review will be back next Sunday. Please stay with TVP World and stand with Ukraine.